an apparent new discovery regarding the Shroud of Turin.
I, several years ago, did a whole radio documentary on the Shroud of Turin, and I approached that myself as pretty much a skeptic.
The part that I think is mind-bending that I haven't heard a single explanation from is
It is a rather a unique thing. What's even more fascinating is that when you do apply a kind of AI 3D filter to this thing, it's suddenly...
Ruslan.
all of these folks that you're describing. We've talked about Richard Dawkins, cultural Christian, Douglas Murray, Christian atheist, Tom Holland, who seems way closer to where Jordan Peterson is, right? There's this need to rationalize and to intellectualize and to have a form of evidence, right? Now, I think evidence is a loaded term because the only real way to prove the resurrection is with a time machine and a video camera, right? Which is what something Alex O'Connor posed to Jordan Peterson, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But this week, the Shroud of Turin has went mega viral again, right? And what they're finding out, according to these studies, is that the initial 1980 study that they took a sample and they carbon dated it back to the medieval phase. One was a flawed study. Two was probably taken of a piece that was fixed, that was burnt
it was
up in
like
fire.
a patch up of it from the fire.
Yeah. So they're finding that the 1980s study is inconclusive and false, and the new studies that they've done has actually traced it back to the time of Jesus in the region.
The first century.
To the first century, with the seemingly exact marks and injuries that Jesus had. But even better to that, the part that I think is mind-bending that I haven't heard a single explanation from is the photo negative print on this shroud that is you can't replicate it. We don't know how we got it. It makes no sense. Could this Shroud of Turin, now that it's looking like it goes back to the time of Jesus, to the region of Jesus, to the wounds of Jesus, and with the technology that doesn't exist now, can't be replicated, this art can't be replicated, is this as close, do you think, we'll get to the evidence for the resurrection, right? Because if it's a negative of a light beam coming out, the resurrection clearly is an explanation for how this can get made if there's no other way for it to be recreated. So what do you think of all that? And could this be, if the consensus is this is definitely from the region of Jesus, it definitely is the time of Jesus, it definitely has the marks of a crucifixion, and the only way this negative could be made is with the technology that does not exist, and therefore the resurrection is a reasonable explanation. Could this be the evidence that some of these guys need to tip them over from this agnosticism or whatever it is that they have to a full-on theistic view of Jesus?
It could be. It could be. It'll depend on the person in the end. I mean, I, several years ago, did a whole radio documentary on the Shroud of Turin. And I approached that myself as pretty much a skeptic because I'd kind of read all the stuff that, oh, well, people have carbon dated it, and it turns out
mainline scientific consensus on it.
What I'd heard was just, oh, it's probably a forgery. And when I actually went and spoke to people, the Shroudies, as they're called, the people who really have invested their life in investigating this, I discovered, there's a lot more interesting stuff that you don't necessarily always hear in the mainstream kind of coverage of this. And it is this stuff about the fact that, it turns out the radiocarbon dating looks like it took a patch that was actually just a stitch up, just a repair in the medieval times. And so we don't know necessarily. And now this new study seems to show actually it does date back to the first century, this piece of cloth. But yeah, the most interesting thing about the shroud, as you say, was the nature of the print that's on it. It's almost impossible to conceive how that could have been a forgery because now we don't have the means to create that kind of a print. It's only a few microns thick, this photo-negative image. People have said maybe someone painted it on, maybe it was left to bleach. None of those kind of naturalistic ways in which people have tried to explain the shroud seem to work. We can't do it today, let alone back in medieval times. And so it looks like there's something really weird going on with this. It is rather a unique thing. And what's even more fascinating is that when you do kind of apply a kind of AI 3D filter to this thing, it's suddenly, it's not just that it kind of looks like the photonegative of a crucified man. It's that if that sort of was imprinted on this cloth through kind of some kind of burst of radiation or whatever, it looks just like a 3D mold of a face would come out. It's a kind of it's got all these kind of fascinating layers which seem to suggest something interesting to go on. So I kind of went from being agnostic, skeptic about it to like, okay, there's more to this than I thought. And one of the people I interviewed about it, who's a kind of physicist himself and has done a lot of research on the Shroud, he said it's a kind of, for some people, this will be the thing that kind of brings together science and evidence and the historicity of Jesus and the resurrection. And it's this meeting place of science and faith, basically, on this Shroud, which will be enough for some people. And I do know for some people, it's been the kind of missing piece that kind of made them think, you know what, I can take this seriously. Now, I don't want to say our faith in the resurrection is based on the veracity of this item, okay? And of course, there are lots of things about the Shroud that I'm not so keen on. I don't want anyone to be venerating and kind of in any way worshipping a piece of cloth, okay? But I do think it's a fascinating garment, a fascinating thing. And I do think increasingly the evidence seems to be tying it back to that empty grave. But I'm not going to base my faith in the resurrection on that alone, okay? Because I think actually we've been blessed with lots of evidence for the resurrection, historical evidence. You know, the first place I want to turn for evidence for the resurrection is the accounts written down, you know, in the first century by the first followers of Jesus. That was a crazy claim for God-fearing Jewish people to be making, that the Jewish Messiah had both been crucified and been resurrected. They had to have a good reason for saying such crazy stuff that eventually got them persecuted and killed. And there were all kinds of other factors around this that point to the truth of this claim they were making. Lots of interesting historical features of their testimony, of what was happening at the time, just the explosive growth of the early church. There's a kind of resurrection-shaped hole at the center of that. So for me, you know, I'm going to be looking at the big picture, and I'm going to say how interesting that this item also seems to fit really well. And it's just another piece. It's kind of, so it's cumulative for me. I'm not going to say it's all down to whether this item can be dated back to the first century or not. But for me, it's just another piece of evidence that says, actually, if you're willing to suspend your materialistic
presuppositions
that miracles just don't happen.
Yes.
Because in that case, there's no amount of evidence. If that's your worldview, if you say miracles do not happen, then there is no amount of evidence I could give you that would make you believe Jesus came back to life. Even a video recording, you just say, well, someone created it, you know.
It's a deep fake.
It's a deep fake.
It's AI.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
Because if you're committed to the idea that miracles don't happen, then no evidence will shake you from that. There's always going to be a naturalistic explanation you're going to reach for.
Yes.
But if you're willing to suspend that, okay, or even just question that presupposition, it turns out that the resurrection is a fantastic explanation for a whole range of different things. Not just historical evidence, not just the Shroud of Turin, the changed lives of millions of people around the world. That itself is a remarkable piece of evidence for the truth of this story. So for me, I love the Turin Shroud. It's fascinating. I want to investigate more. I think there's a real connection now that's being established between it and the events. But I don't want to just say that's it. I think we are given a plethora of evidence, and we've never lived at a time with more reasons to believe in Jesus' resurrection.
All right, guys, if you want to see the entire version of this podcast, it is available right now on our Patreon community. You can get a free 7-day trial, get the full version of this before anyone else gets it, and it has an extended segment that's entirely too spicy for YouTube. And you'll also get access to all of our future guests, allowing you to be in the live chat while we're doing the podcast, ask them questions, all kinds of cool perks. Go to Patreon right now. The link is in the pinned comment below to get a free 7-day trial. All right? I'll see you over there. Peace.